So the best part about this is I got to read in preparation of this a lot of economic history, a lot of other things, and all these. It was very interesting. But what Albert did was the most helpful thing, and I thank all of you for answering this poll. This is my favorite poll. This is like survey said. 642 people answered the poll on Albert's list. That is excellent. Thank you if you answered this. Why are people leaving? Why are people going? Why are you going? Why are people leaving the Bay Area? 59% of you, and I combined a few of these responses because I had like cost of living and then I had like cost of living if in particular scenarios. So I combined a few things in ways that made sense. 59% was cost of living. Surprise, surprise. Survey, it's like survey said, and it comes up, it's cost of living. It's like, thank you, Captain Obvious Riley White, here to tell us that it's very expensive.
And overwhelmingly too, like,
really
5 times the second one, which was people aren't leaving.
Right. And this is the fun part. So I looked at these things and I said, the two I focused on was cost of living. And then I focused on the hype, on whether or not people are leaving, because that required the two greatest things. Taxes, of course. California has one of the highest tax rates in the country, right? And then there's crime as well. Crime is problematic, especially this. People argue the political climate. People argue the quality of life. And crime is part of the quality of life measure, but quality of life, I think, in the sense of ask an expat Californian, in one word, what they don't miss, and it's traffic. And, these things that matter in a lot of other ways. So that I took as being more multidimensional. Cost of doing business, it's expensive, 2%. Homelessness, 2%, and a whole bunch of other factors. Some of you offered some incredibly specific factors. And I'm like, this is genuinely impressive. You have very, very, very righteous concerns here. So why are people leaving? Cost of living. So I'm gonna look at this first, cost of living. How bad is it? Will it improve? Is it going to look better? What do the numbers say? And this becomes a really, really interesting thing. Oh, Hamad, you had a question. I see you raised that.
Yes, hi. Yes, hi. Very nice to be here, by the way.
Oh,
I think one of the... Yeah. I think I would say one or two reasons would be one, I think, because I've been to California, and it's quite gentrified as an area because I think there's been a lot of displacement of the previous population. I think that's what I think, and because of that, I think the expenses and obviously the property prices tend to rise up and have gone quite high in California, at least. I mean. Wouldn't you agree with that? I think.
Oh, I would agree, Hamad, and that's exactly what we're going to get into, and this is true, and it's a significant factor not only for the people that have moved in and replaced people that might have lived there beforehand, and let's think about this. So maybe this. So one of the reasons. So I'll tell you to start with my own life here, and so when I came out, I'm at the University of New Mexico. My dad's family, obviously from the Bay Area and other things. And I was offered when I was on the job market 8 years ago before I got off my PhD program. And I was on the job market and I got an offer from a very good California school in the Bay Area. And I was like, this is your great job. But I'm a professor. I'm not, I'm a professor with no inherited wealth. So I'm not somebody who can, and I looked at this and my wife looks at me and she goes, where are we going to live? And I looked at this and I looked at the map and I was doing calculations in my head of like which part of, all right, if I can stack my classes 2 days a week and I live in Stockton and we have all these other things that go into this, it's very, very hard, right? Because one of the other dualities of being, if you're a working professional, if you go out there and you say, can I buy a house? Can I achieve that American dream thing, right? That everyone has this thing and everyone's doing this. And it becomes a critical question. And it bothered me because I thought about this and, because my grandmother was there and, everyone was there at that time 8 years ago. And I thought it would be such a fun time. And even my grandmother, you're seeing this, a schedule of processes that exist that are very interesting, that have happened over a long period of time. And my grandmother grew up in a house in kind of outer Richmond, kind of off of 41st in San Francisco. And at the time, that neighborhood was, it's Russian immigrants, it's Irish immigrants, it's Chinese immigrants, and these people came in. It was the affordable part of San Francisco at the time. And then what happens are you either stayed there, were able to recognize the price appreciation, or you moved out into East Bay or somewhere else. But people tended to stay in California. And this is the interesting part to see what happens. Where are people going, and is this real? So cost of living, Hamad, you're absolutely right. So the question is, And I want you all to think about this, because this is a cycle. This is the cycle of a superstar city. This is how this happens, right? And let's think about this. I read a bunch of things, read Matt Iglesias, other things. We're bringing a bunch of things down the table to see if this works. And this is how it goes down. And I want you to start at the top on this magical graphic that looks like it came from 1998, and I apologize. But it's like geocities.com/economics/ Magic Mountain /finance. But anyway, growth industries exist. They start. And this is think of the birth of the true Silicon Valley. I mean, not just people in garages in the early 80s. We're talking about 90s when people started attracting money. Growth industries create high-paying jobs. Highly compensated professionals then move to the city and they help bid up the land value. Then zoning and geography often limit new construction, right? Because the Bay Area's been here for a long time, right? You can't just, it's not an open space where you can start mass building housing to accommodate this. You're building over or within housing that's already there. And then you see this process happen everywhere. Working class wages, they start rising in response to this because people start being able to afford more things. But the wages of workers at the lower end of the ladder don't rise fast enough to allow them to afford that even match in a meaningful way the price appreciation of these properties. So what happens is working class people leave. They're replaced by more highly paid professionals, Hamad. And this is kind of what Hamad brought that up as well. And high housing costs that have become part of this cycle are now they're now embedded as a sort of permanent filter, which encourages a very specific type of unbalanced growth. You don't have everybody moving in. You don't have families and young people being able to survive well. You have a situation where prices have been bid up. There isn't enough houses being built. Consequently, prices rise. Working class people leave. And then the only people who can afford to live there are other highly paid professionals. And that creates all kinds of issues with everything from the services cities are able to provide to the consequences, right? And it's no joke. It's hard to be a teacher. It's hard to be a working, or even not a working class professional, a white collar worker living in the Bay Area, period. And this cycle continues. And the only thing that happens, if you only have highly paid workers in one area, then that encourages growth industries and more high tech booms, right? And that's what happened, right? We saw a boom. We're going to follow the graph of real estate prices in Santa Fe, starting at from the 89 quake. And then you had that kind of drop off. And then 90s, you can see the point at which it tipped towards high real estate prices in the Bay Area. And that's a good question. So Albert brings up, and he's like, it seems like a cycle that repeats itself a lot, but will there be a point where the cycle breaks, or is the weather just too good? Well, that's a good question. How do you break this cycle? So this is what happens in other places, right? So the hard part is not everybody has this sort of situation, right? Eventually we have this sort of thing. So let's talk about, will this cycle break? How can you get beyond this, right? And the hard part is you have to go back into history and think about, in an aggregate sense, and this is a shout out to my liberal arts majors out there. I know there's a few of you. Thank you for hanging on. But think back in time, right? We had, the earliest cities, or in even medieval Damascus were incredibly wealthy cities. And San Francisco follows, or the Bay Area in general, but San Francisco and Silicon Valley has followed, and San Jose gets credit, has followed the long sort of process of cities that have been built up, have become incredibly wealthy, become world-leading cities. And then ultimately the question is what happens? Do they disappear overnight? And there's not a fear of that immediately, right? And a rise of remote work. We're going to talk about that, Vincent. This is good. But the question is, and when we think about how these cycles break, ultimately the cycle itself starts to unwind. Ultimately, sometimes, and it's hard to say that, right? So Detroit of the 1930s didn't become Detroit of 2021 in a few years. And it wasn't because real estate prices dropped immediately to where they were and we called it a day and new workers moved in. What happens is that it's a very gradual, long-term process that cities evolve in. And when capital is injected in high amounts, prices continue to rise. When capital leaves or starts to take flight, it's a slow deflating balloon. And that's what happens in most cases. throughout history. And that's the interesting part about this. And Albert brought up, and oh my gosh, there's so many questions. This is great. So this is good. Hold on, let me catch up. 110 software developers making $100,000 a year are considered low paid. Yeah, I mean, that's right. It's like, I have 24, you live in a situation where you realize you wake up one day and you're living on an illegal property in the Farallon Islands, sharing an illegal duplex with 24 different software designers. And you have to swim to shore every morning. And this is the hard part because it's so difficult. 100 grand would buy you a magnificent house in Iowa. But the problem is that's the question is where you work and how you're entitled to be and your quality of life. I mean, all of that drives you to places where there are other people that are like you. A competitive environment exists in superstar cities that enable people to engage and interact with each other at the highest quality. So I believe San Francisco considers 110 to qualify for low-income benefits. Wow. Steve points out, doesn't have to break at some point when those working class jobs can no longer afford to live in the area. Won't it just start to implode? Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, and this is interesting. We'll relate this, and we're seeing this in a very interesting way in San Francisco now. And one of the ways you can look at that, if you use just the city of San Francisco as a proxy, you've seen a decline in home ownership rates over the last 20 years that has been pretty constant. Now it's somewhere around 50-50, people that own homes, people that don't own homes, and that number is declining every year. And this is an interesting thing, and remote work will have an effect on this. So let's see, let's dive deep into this here. So let's look at this, and this is the fun thing. So what happens here? And this is sort of, let's look at the process. So this is the hypothesis, this is like the theory. Here's the reality. Here's the data sourced from the Bay Area Council Economic Institute. So take a look at net domestic migration in the Bay Area before the pandemic in 2018. So this sorts you by income level. That's a great question, Hamad, for a different section. Let's talk about London. International cities, all of these have different regional dynamics and urban economics that are fascinating. So look at the net domestic migration in the Bay Area here for a second. It's sorted by age and household income. And if you look at this, I mean, across the board, across all ages, people who earn less than 75 grand leave in net losses to the Bay Area population. You start getting back, but people who are very wealthy move in, right? At the other level, people who are rich, above $300,000 in household income, almost all ages, with the exception of persnickety 55 to 65-year-olds, all of these groups demonstrate a positive net migration into the Bay Area. So it's interesting that we're seeing this split right across income lines, almost more than anything else. This is good. Let me go back up here to get these questions. So on the other hand, will continued high cost of living also force innovation? In this case, some sort of automation for large businesses like supermarkets and restaurants. So yes, that's a question. I don't have data on that specifically. You have a choice. You can either, you're confronted by a choice. You either have to, this is a challenge because it's not naive enough to say you have to. So there's a few things that can happen. One is automation of jobs that require low-income workers or working class individuals. And the other question is do you have, could you remedy this another way? And it's often, it's a challenge to build, it's like, the Bay Area is like a boom city built off of, a period of latency built on another boom city. And you have this cycle where, in the event that San Francisco was sparsely populated back in 1990, they could have simply built up large amounts of real estate and the access housing would have kept prices fairly low. That's sort of what happened, relatively speaking, in places in Texas in the last 20 or 30 years. They've had ample space. You can just keep building, a completely different dynamic. In San Francisco, you have complex property zoning laws, restrictions, and other things. Even if you flipped a switch and removed them overnight, that still might change aggregate demand. Other cities across the world that are very expensive, like Beijing, have frankly a stronger history at maintaining high-rise infrastructure, and people might be happier to live in them. And it's an interesting situation. We would have to create a culture by which people would want to live and want to see a high-density development, and that becomes an incredibly tricky and hot-button issue for a lot of people. And this is really tricky. Oh my gosh, this is good. It's a small town, expensive living, survival of the richest. Yes. Katie, can you comment on how the pandemic and many tech companies are moving to remote first, allowing people to live in tier 2 markets with only slightly less than the Bay Area salary might contribute to rebalancing demographics? So in short, that would work if it happened in mass. And that's a great question. And I would comment on this, noting that as a functional fact of human behavior, we know that hypothetically that does make sense, right? Any of us would want, would hypothetically move to where we could live in a place that was affordable, and a Bay Area salary or an almost Bay Area salary and anywhere else in the country, with the exception of maybe of like Manhattan, would be is a very good salary in parts of Boston and other things. I know it's a complex market, but you live in these areas. But the other thing as well is that the same sort of high performing professional that is attracted to the Bay Area also is attracted to other ambitious projects. They want to advance in their corporate careers. They want to do other things. They might feel tethered in some way effectively to their organization. And that becomes the really challenging part. That's a structural and labor dynamic issue that we're just starting to see. So yes, I could live in St. Louis, but if I lived in, if I continue to live in the Bay Area, I can go into work sometimes, and I'm stand more likely, maybe a better chance at getting that promotion. And there's all these other pressures, and then there's frictions. If you're from the Bay Area, it's very hard to sort of rationalize moving somewhere else. And labor frictions are a part of every market. The European Union, one issue, structural issues that even with the free movement of labor, you don't see a lot of it because of linguistic concerns, economic concerns, cultural concerns. It's a huge amount of diversity across the continent. And it's similar in the United States. It's very hard to get somebody to pick up and move from a place they're familiar with. And so I think that the effect of people moving to tier 2 markets will not be as significant as I think hoped. But we'll get into that. That's a great question, Katie. But it is right now, I don't possess enough data, and I will defer to it. So Albert says, we have plenty of space. It's far to drive up cancer. All right, lots of land. He's got a place. Everyone goes camping. London is also ridiculous for a lot of other reasons too, which is interesting. So it's not the only place. This is great. You guys are asking great questions. I love this. I love the chat window questions, and people on Facebook Live are like, what's happening? Question, Albert, did I miss anything?
I think you get your work cut out for you. I think so we thought, why not question the professor properly then this time.
No, I like it. I love questions. Questions are great. I want to thank everyone who asked a question, and I really appreciate that. This is my favorite part. And in this world of Zoom sessions, it's a form of human interaction that you don't get as much.
Exactly.
It's great. It's great.
Plus, you get to know people.
Oh my goodness. So let's talk about this. So before we talked about this, about a month ago, Albert and I were talking about this, and we looked at this. We looked at the real estate data across the aggregate San Francisco, and the San Francisco Bay Area, and we said, there's not significant enough flight from real estate markets that we've seen the real estate market adjust accordingly. And let's talk a little bit. Let's break down into this and actually see how this works. So cost of living. So let's talk about this. Number one cost that most people associate with the Bay Area, my guess is your number one point in the cost of living is the cost of housing, the most expensive cost among cities. In San Francisco, the average person spends 41% of their income on housing. That's an incredibly large number. It's actually way above what any rational financial professional would suggest would be something that somebody should pay for. But it is the biggest cost, and it is often the most significant driver. So if we track this data, so looking at San Francisco in aggregates from 1987, right? We had a growth through the 80s, right? We had the 89 quake that kind of put, gradual things in there. Early 90s, we haven't really hit a significant level of Silicon Valley boom yet on the property market. 1996 was a level. 1989 to 1996, the property values were basically in stasis, and then they shot up. Tech bubble, internet, all the things we just explained across that cycle increased through the next, through the 2000 period into the 2001 recession, affected prices only a little bit. People who were employed by other firms moved to other firms. They stayed in the Bay Area. They built up prices. Like every other city in the country, every other area in the country, the Bay Area was affected by the mortgage crisis. Mortgage properties were built up, and then they fell again back in the recession. But since then, the secondary high tech bubble, this next thing that we're seeing between 2010 and 2020 has seen property values skyrocket to places they've never been before. And even in the first few months that we've seen in 2021, this is more of the same. And I thought about this and I said, this is interesting. but I bet you it's not equal for each region. And this is where it becomes a little hard, right? So let's break up the Bay Area into 4 big pieces. Let's break this. Let's go over to East Bay. Let's go over to Oakland, Berkeley. Let's go to Livermore. Those prices are going up, right? So stay on the left-hand side. Same thing, looks like San Francisco. I've changed the window now, 5 years. So this is just the 5-year growth rate. The 5-year growth rate was steep in real estate until about mid 2018, early 2019. It bottomed out a little bit, but it's still growing. It's still growing, and it's still becoming even more expensive. Santa Rosa, got to bring in our north, Sonoma action here, and Sonoma, similar thing, almost looks identical to East Bay. Upper right. Now here's where we get a little bit interesting. And if we separate this into cities, so if we separate this and we start looking at, well, let's look at San Francisco, let's look at Redwood City, let's look at north part of Silicon Valley, and then southern part of Silicon Valley. Let's take a look down to San Jose, Sunnyvale, and let's see how those prices have changed. We've seen that those real estate prices peaked 2018, early 2019, and have since gone down. And even in San Francisco in aggregate, looking at all transactions, they've also gone down. A note of caution, right? And stay away from the, yes, that's a hard part though. Yes. Also, so here's the thing. Hold on, Albert. The peninsula is where you've seen the most growth anyway. So on the left-hand axis, this is really hard to read. So everything is tracked based on an original baseline from 1995, right? From 1995, which isn't an infinity ago, right? I remember that. That's only 26 years ago. 26 years ago, the price was evened out at 100 for all these properties. So if you're in East Bay or you're in Sonoma, you're looking at 3.4 to 3.9 times more valuable real estate in this time period. On the peninsula, you're looking at, it peaked at 4.3 to 4.6 times more. That's a huge increase over a 26-year period. Normally across the country, we would look at a fair real estate growth period on a year-on-year basis of about 3 or 4%. Ultimately, that level of thing is usually unsustainable. But we've seen some pushback in San Francisco, but they're far from being deals. And right now, it's still 4 times more expensive to buy something in the north part of the peninsula than it was back in 1995. And that's a large amount of money. I know, 1995. I know, why didn't you all, the moral of this is, why didn't everyone buy a house in 1995? That's the moral. How were you? You're like, some of you weren't alive, some of you were too young. This is okay. But that's the moral of the story. And this is what we've seen, is some pushback on those angles. Now, this is interesting, right? And so the question is, are we seeing some of this? And the hard part about this is, take this data with a grain of salt. This is from the Federal Bureau of Economic Research, of course, which is very, very reputable. But the data, of course, when we talk about all transactions, sometimes those properties can cause distortions. And I don't know, I don't have enough of the data in front of me to decide if there has been distortions. I'd have to track property selling. For instance, sometimes the same property sells multiple times over and over again. It might create an economic effect that we're not accounting for. Oh, good. Carol Steinfeld. The urbanization trend. Half of the US living in coastal cities by 2020 was predicted in the late 1980s. It was, and look what happened. Everybody's here. Everybody's there. This is the story. Carol's absolutely right. And look at this. So the other thing is, if we look at this, San Francisco versus the United States as a whole, United States asset prices have increased, not significantly as high as other places across the country. So looking at the top chart, in San Francisco, since the last recession, has outpaced the real estate price growth than anywhere else in the country. Not anywhere else in the country, than the country as a whole. There are places that have increased in value more. But San Francisco, the interesting part about this is an incredibly rich city already, increasing their prices beyond certain values. And this becomes a big question, right? And so initially I thought, and so I was looking at the data and I said, initially what's happening in all around the country is prices are shooting up in various cities across the country. And a lot of that is driven by supply, actual supply of the market of homes. And there are a few people who are offering their homes for sale during the pandemic. And consequently, those few houses, you're still having a lot of people demand to buy houses, and demand is outstripping the supply, which means that encourages the price to go up for these houses. And what happened in the Bay Area has been a little bit different. Looking at the real estate data coming out in December, January, and February, the amount of supply is actually higher than when it was last year. And I think that's interesting. So not only are prices increasing, it is not tethered to the same supply constraints that we're seeing across many markets across the country in the same way, I should say. And I think that's really, really, really interesting. And the monthly supply of houses across the country, again, I'm not kidding you. The monthly supply of houses in the United States as a whole is the lowest we've seen in my lifetime. And it bottomed out back in like a month and a half ago. And we've seen a situation that this is very severe. I know Hamad, I gotta do a London breakdown one day. I'm gonna have to go into London one day. That's above my pay grade, Hamad. I have to see. This is tricky. I don't know. Like the London dynamic's got to be interesting. I mean, I know, whether, I don't know if a lot of people are commuting from Essex or other place. I don't know if London's an interesting question. I have to decide that more. When we think about Bay Area home sales, and this is the kicker for cost of living, right? You think about the idea of owning a home, and why is owning a home conceptually important? And I don't mean a home per se in the traditional sense of I need these things, or I need X number of kids, or I need these other things. This is the idea that homes for most middle and upper middle class individuals represent the single largest source of wealth that they will contribute or have in their lifetime. And it's very hard. It's very hard to save it using other means, right? And some people might be fortunate enough, they get hired, they get that dream job, they get those stock options, they have the investments, and they let the investments take care of themselves. Now, the Bay Area home sales have been very interesting. We'll go back to October of 2020, right? The middle of where the pandemic is still even more uncertain. We're looking at a situation where we had that second big kick really starting up and making things worse for a lot of people in the pandemic across California, across the United States. San Francisco's median home price, the median home price in San Francisco was 1.6 million. And compare that to even Marin is at 1.469 million. Contra Costa, surprisingly cheap at 787,000. But these numbers are very, very high relative to anywhere else in the country. And if you do not or are not in a position to inherit wealth, if you were in my position when I looked at that job interview and I went, I would love to live here, but then I went, can't do it today. I'm sorry, Grandma, I'm moving somewhere else. It's a situation that is alarming for a lot of people. And I think that if think about it this way, even saving for that down payment, right? If you're sitting in a situation where even with that $100,000 programming job that you've secured, and you think about after taxes, you think about after saving, 401k living expenses, right? I mean, paying for a small apartment becomes challenging in that's reasonably close to your work. You have other expenses, you have student loans, you have expenses that often weigh down your fiscal situation. And then the idea that you can somehow save to get a down payment for even among the higher jumbo standards of jumbo mortgages in the Bay Area. If you wanted to put 20% down on a house in San Francisco, 20% down of 1.6 million is still $325,000. And that's a ton of money. And that's a lot of money for somebody to have at one time. And that gets challenging, and that gets really, really challenging. And but you're looking at this, the home price changes have been flexible. And this is back in October, it's a little bit old. I want to thank the Chronicle for this. Chronicle has a bunch of good graphics, which I'm going to use. But the number of homes sold has increased year on year throughout the pandemic across the Bay Area. And the home prices themselves have gone up. Look at this, 14, 17% increases across parts of the Bay Area, except for San Francisco, which saw a little decline, and that's what we saw in the previous chart. And so we're going to see about this. So anyway, so what we've seen about this is when you have a situation where no one can afford, unless you're in a position, and I'm not, by the way, I don't bear any ill will to people who have at least been on that side of the wheel of Fortunatus, involving having inherited or having had the ability of having money. Most people, of course, are not in that position. And so I'm really speaking to a bunch of other people here when I talk about this. What happens is, as part of this cycle, is the San Francisco County homeownership rate has dropped significantly. It was 59% in 2005. It's dropped, or 50, it was, it reached around 60% in 2006. And then it dropped back to 2021. We're looking at rates that are really close to 50% and are likely to fall further as you're looking at developers, looking at converting properties into income generating properties. Those maintain values, and you have a lot of demand to live there. And it's difficult to see, unless we see drops in the real estate market, how this will pan out. And the question is okay, let's talk about the real estate market. Let's talk about the rental market then. And so if we compare that to the amount people are actually spending to rent properties, likewise, it'll still set you back for a 1-bedroom apartment rent in San Francisco, about $2,650, San Jose, about $2,180 per month. And then, Vallejo, you're looking at $1,470, below the state median in California, which is around $1,700. And these values are still prohibitively high to encourage saving and encouraging property from happening. And so the other way is we don't look at, so if you guys are like, well, let's think about things that aren't real estate with regards to the cost of things. Let's talk about consumer price indexes. And if we look at Pacific cities in the US average, so even in the last few months during the pandemic, we've seen an uptick in percent changes of consumer prices, usually around 1% a year, but we've seen a little uptick in January of about 0.4%. Part of that's recovery, but part of that's a little bit what's going to cause the basis of our next talk about, is the economy, in a position where it might overheat. But if we look at even here, San Francisco, which is right there down at the bottom, it's hard to read. It's because it uses bi-monthly data. But December 2020, October 2020, San Francisco's CPI was increasing at 1.1%, 2%. It's dropped to 0.4%, but it's still among the highest month-on-month increases on the West Coast. And that's a really interesting thing. And if we think about all urban consumers, and then we think about urban wage earners and other things, it's more or less the same story. It remains very, very high. And I think that becomes an issue, particularly as we go ahead to the near future. And then let's think about this. So the first thing is 59% of you said it's too expensive to live. You're right. But is that enough to cause a California exodus? And this is great. You guys saw this. This has been passed around on the interwebs for a few weeks, and I want to I actually saw this chart, then somebody else posted it on the announcement for it, and I'm like, yes, this is what we're going to talk about. I already copied that chart. Thank you to the Chronicle. But let's think about this. Is it a myth? And we've seen most of the time when people leave the peninsula, people leave San Francisco even specifically, they're moving to other parts of the Bay Area. But there has been an increase in overall net migration. So, as they say, what was the old adage, Albert? For every one person that leaves California, 5 people come. Is that right? So,
yeah, that was it.
That was it. That's the one. So in this case, we're looking at a situation where more people are actually leaving than arriving, but the migration is mainly going to Alameda, to Marin, to Contra Costa, to Sonoma, to other places around the Bay Area. This is where people are moving. Now, that being said, there are some things to note about this, and I know you've kind of had a sense about this. When we look at the Bay Area in aggregate, where do we go from here? In the Bay Area, 84,000 people moved within the Bay Area during first 3 quarters of 2020. 24,000 moved somewhere else in California. And you can kind of see that here. It's on this chart. In addition to the Bay Area, you have a lot of movement. Some people moved to LA, San Diego, Riverside, those areas. But over here, people that actually moved out of state, not significant numbers. 749 people to Texas a year is not something to worry about, or in 3 quarters of a year are not something to worry about. 13 people packed up and moved to New Hampshire. 529 people to Nevada, and about 1,227 to Washington. So what does this mean? And what does this mean? And this is really interesting. Is this something to be concerned about? In aggregate, looking at the 4th quarter, 114,000 people left the Bay Area. Now that's a big number. That's 29% higher than it was in 2019. And the reason you're reading so many articles about this. 54,000 people entered the Bay Area, which is below 2019 values. So think about it this way. If you cross those two values, we had a little bit of net exodus in 2019 relative to 2018, but it was just much bigger. The spread between these two numbers, people coming in versus people coming out in aggregate, are significant. Now, that being said, when we break it down to the county by county basis, it's not the same across the Bay Area. And notably, Marin and Contra Costa, again, they saw net gains of people moving in versus people moving out. And this is the question. 27,000 people still moved to San Francisco, Albert points out, probably to take advantage of the 40% decline in rent. What about companies who are leaving the Bay Area should be worried about that? I'm envious of the 78 people who left and packed up for Hawaii, all 78 of them. Former Albert's List members, now the Honolulu office of Albert's List, now having it. And Hawaii, yes, Hawaii is more expensive, and right across the board on every CPI index, it is an aggregate more expensive. And so let's think about this. And so you have so far. So here's let's break it down into a final conclusive thing. You have the weather, as Hamad points out. Break this down and conclude. Let's talk about a conclusion here. So on one hand, we know that the physical number of workers leaving the Bay Area is not significant enough in aggregate in a metropolitan area this large to cause significant reductions in say real estate prices as well as rental prices yet. We know that some companies have packed up and at least moved corporate offices or considering or within the process of moving corporate offices to other states. And the problem is, and this is where it becomes difficult. What will be the net effect on Silicon Valley? And right now, because of the concentration of wealth from everything from venture capital firms to startup companies to people who have developed a depth of bench with regards to risk and expertise, they are still large and vast in the Bay Area. It is still here. And people, by human nature, cities have a tendency to specialize in the same sense that New York has specialized very heavily in finance and other activities. And London has the biggest FX market, foreign exchange market in the world. And among all kinds of other things, every city has certain aspects to it that make it a world or global or superstar city. And in San Francisco, it is technology. And these levels, the numbers I've seen, the numbers I've looked at, none of these things, Stanford, I'm going to answer that question, Albert. That made me laugh. If none of these things ended up, let me put it this way. If none of these numbers that I'm looking at show a mass exodus, the question is, will one happen? And I think there is an interesting tipping point. And think of it this way. And here's the sobering reality is will, Albert pointed out in the comments, he goes, if Stanford University announced they'd be moving to Utah tomorrow, that might be the end of it. That's right. There it is. Stanford, now located in Provo, Utah. Good luck. That's fun. It's going to be a lot of annoyed tenured faculty there that I know. But one of those things, they'll be really angry. They'll be unpleasant. And so what happens is in this situation is we don't see the numbers yet. Will they happen? It's unlikely that real estate will become appreciably more, it's incredibly unlikely that real estate will become appreciably more affordable in the Bay Area anytime soon. That's the sobering reality. To have that happen, you would need a mass exodus of a very large amount. And many people, reading the comments, and like some people are like, yes, people can leave. And that's the general sense. If you leave, then real estate will go down and I can afford things and there'll be less traffic. And it makes sense. And it makes sense from a lot of different perspectives. But it's not there yet because there are economic advantages to a concentration of highly specialized professionals located in very small areas. And that means that a company who wanted to start up a tech industry company can go to Texas, but their talent pool will be different, right? And the universities that engage them who have spent years specializing in technology across the Bay Area and specializing in developing those graduates and master's programs in other places, it's going to be very challenging. And Albert's points out, this is a whole other thing, Albert. Universities are ripe for a vast restructuring in general. I think universities uprooting would be a bigger impact because they would take research with them, he points out. VC dollars that result from that research. And 3, intellectual property at low cost. And 4, companies that want to hire them are nearby. You're absolutely right. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't, but most of the time you're right, Albert. And I think that's the key point. And a bigger question will be, will a gradual reformation in the way that college and university education happens, will that change the way that happens? Will distance learning affect the way that graduates go and attend and their job prospects and opportunities? Will it become normalized in a way that people will feel comfortable living in Minnesota, but taking classes at UC Berkeley? And this is a fascinating question. And Facebook and Google are still building offices in the Bay Area, even during the pandemic, Albert points out. Can they afford to stop building it? Would they just take the loss? There's some questions about San Francisco's status about a global city too. So all those are fantastic questions. And so if we look at the net construction, so construction jobs in general, construction in the Bay Area, like the problem is that demand, the reason real estate prices are so high is that demand still outstrips supply by a significant margin. And so I think that even among commercial real estate, which is often the most iffy and often the most difficult markets to operate in, even office space can be persnickety in a lot of markets, I think demand will still be there. Now, that being said, there are realities, right? And if a company can produce workers who are happy and live elsewhere and move perhaps not out of the Bay Area itself, but to more affordable parts of the Bay Area, I think that could happen. Yes, Brett brings up a good point. I heard that as well on Apple, Brett. Stephen Carmen asks, what will the effect of a major earthquake be on housing prices? Loma Prieta quake caused half of people to leave the San Jose area. It took 5 to 7 years to recover. It would be significant. I don't want anyone to be sitting on the fault saying it's going to be significant. I was talking to one of my friends from Berkeley yesterday, and she was telling me, she was talking about, her parents had just sold their house and left California. And the interesting part about it is they were looking at this. Obviously, they bought up back, years and years ago, and they're sitting, on the Hayward Fault, saying, why would anyone buy this house, and why will this house appreciate in value? And it kept appreciating. They just sat on it, it kept appreciating. People moved to the Bay Area, it kept appreciating, and they sat and ended up selling the house at a tremendous amount of equity. Earthquakes do have long-term economic impacts. And I would say, with regard to specifics around Stephen's question, like for instance, if we go back to San Francisco, 89, we're talking about 7 years before the price recovered. And again, there was a recession in there. There was the 90 recession. And but 7 years is often what it takes. And I think that's reasonable. So, but that's also a relative thing. So I don't think, and I hope there won't be a devastating earthquake of any kind in the next anytime soon. Little shakers are okay, but nothing terrible. In that case, then you'd end up with it's 5 to 8 years, 5 to 7 years, drop in property values, a recovery, but the property value drop isn't going to drop, so substantially that it will enable our $100,000 salaried programmer with incredible skills to be able to buy most properties in the Bay Area. Albert asks, and I'm curious to hear who is moving by race as well. Is it older and wealthier? Younger and mix of minorities and white? Has the data been correlated? Oh, that's such a great question. That's such a great question. So let me see. And the hard part is this is tricky because homeownership differs across many dimensions. And the Bay Area migration is, and I just located a couple of data here. So if I look at an aggregate, I have a little bit of older data on that. And I didn't talk about it because we're talking about data that dates from 2015. And if I can, and one good source of this data is something called the Urban Displacement Project. And they do some really good, data. But the hard part is let me see if I can access it quickly. But there are sources online where you can access this and research this for individual rate by income, race, other aspects that become really, really important. We've seen successively in San Francisco that's changed drastically, right? So we know that neighborhoods have either become gentrified and different populations have moved in and moved out. Different immigrant communities and the waves of immigrants that came at the early part of the 20th century have graduated to other waves of situations. That's a great question. I have to answer that at a different time. Earthquake, even less available real estate, Carol points out. That's right. Albert, have salaries decreased because remote technology roles? Not yet. We're not seeing salary decreases yet. That's the hard part. In aggregate, the aggregate numbers are still showing that salaries are holding pretty steady, especially among white collar workers. Will the exodus lead to taxable revenue because employees are working elsewhere? Ooh, good question. So the question is that, so if you have, so this is the hard part. And I think that if we think about a net displacement of wealth, then yes. So if we're talking about highly wealthy people leaving the Bay Area for other places to live with high salaries in other places. The problem is, though, is that income taxes can be taxed. You usually get, you're taxed both in your state you work in as well as the state you move to, but then you might be awarded an income tax credit depending on the state where you move to, that regulation. So if you lived in Colorado, and I don't know Colorado's rules specifically, I'm just picking it, or Utah, let's use it. Stanford University moves to Utah. Suddenly now you're working in Utah, but you're being paid by an organization that's domiciled in California. Technically, you're an employee of a California institution. You pay California taxes. I don't know Utah's law about that, but for instance, in a no income tax state like New Hampshire, you'd still have to pay California taxes. So I'm not worried per se about the tax revenue breakdown, but I am worried ultimately about the unsustainability of the demographic mix in the towns that are ultimately affected by those taxes. So imagine still having to pay $3,500 a month for a 1-bedroom right after an earthquake. Yes, make sure you have in your leases, make sure you have if there is an earthquake, and don't just make it wait for the big ones. Just be like, anything above 2.0. I want to renegotiate my lease. Sabrina asks, what about the impact of the recent frequency of wildfires? That's a really good question. That was one of the other things that came out, right? And everywhere in the West has this, right? We have wildfires that are increasingly severe and increasingly vast. And we think about how that responds to air quality and other things. And I think the hard part is when we look at the number of Californians who can move other places, the most common thing is we see Californians moving to other places in the West, and those places are also affected by fires. So we have a situation where fires are ultimately important for quality of life, but the hard part is often those trade-offs are natural beauty and climate-based and other things that people find important. Yes, Hamad, I can send you links. Here's the link to, let's see if this is still online here. Let me see if I can. I'm having some trouble. Let me grab this really quick. Hamad, that's really good. So let's grab this. There we go. So here's one. This is the Bay Area urban displacement by race and income. That's often very useful to show where people move and how people get out. Byron points out your corporation probably has nexus in multiple states. Yeah. Texas doesn't have a reliable power grid. California has fires. I guess you have to pick your disaster. That's the case in most of the country. Then you have places, you have other places, the least, disaster free, and many people don't want to live there. Hamad says, what about geopolitical shifts like Brexit in the UK and cities like London? Hamad, I'm sensing a lot of London focus here. This is pretty good. Yes, so this is good. So let me get back to the question of Dave. I know, Dave, I love that you focused on the data, and I have a quick answer for that. Hamad's, I like your London questions on Brexit, political shifts in Brexit in the UK. The question is, will it affect the London financial sector, which is a big driver of city tax revenue and income and global status, or will that move to Europe? And that's going to be an interesting question on the UK. And I think the UK, I think both sides have over-exaggerated different economic points on that. Dave asked, and this is good. He tokes on the previous slide here. I'm sorry. So in this slide here, he looks at this, and this are actually two different time frames, Dave. And so this map itself dates from March through November, whereas the data that I'm specifying here is just fourth quarter. So fourth quarter, last quarter, October, November, December. This is March through November. If that answers your question, David. Thank you, Dave. So they're two different time frames. And I was talking about, I had to get the most recent data possible. First quarter 2021, we're still in it. So I couldn't get it yet. And maybe after watching this, you're like, oh, I got to leave. Sabrina says many tech companies that are going remote first are also modifying salaries if you relocate to lower Colorado State. That's also a realistic situation. And the hard part is the salary mix is tricky. It depends on, and this is what we get into personal consumption baskets. So everyone has an individual economic requirement to buy a certain thing, right? So some of us put a high priority on, say, buying a house, or some of us might put a high priority on buying a nice car. It might be something else. And the question is a mixture of those individualized priorities, which are also determined by an entire lifetime of experiences, often help dictate whether workers will respond to them or not. But as Sabrina points out, most of the time when people say to move somewhere else, if a company can get away with paying you less money in a different state, it probably will. And what does that mean for your career? Carol says, the biggest question in Silicon Valley is where to move to. Cities should market themselves to firms much more, with school quality, recreation, culture, and a cost of real estate emphasized. You're absolutely right. The hard part is the grass greener in other places? Crime exists in other places. Traffic exists in other places, although maybe not as magnificent as trying to commute in traffic in the rush hour. Stephen points out, is the wildfire situation just a result of people suppressing fires that would naturally occur until a large event occurs? Fires across areas normally occurred every 50 to 100 years in historical California. That's really good. Stephen's actually, this is of course very useful. Fire suppression. Well, not a fire. I have I have a sister who works for the National Park Service. I will defer to her. She was up in Oregon, okay, I love it. But this is a good question. But you're absolutely right. Fire thinning and other things and aspects of fire management are important. Sabrina, cost of living, good. Albert's lots of companies have moved. Oh goodness. Albert says, lots of companies have moved to Houston, San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, home to many. Charles Schwab. If you're willing to tolerate Dallas weather where it's 45 degrees one day and 82 the next, it ends up being pretty okay. Oh man. Good gosh. Do you think a potential Gavin Newsom recall would spur people to move back if he loses? That's a good question. Who are we? That's a man. I have so far, I work very hard to not involve myself in political discourse. It's difficult to say. Most of the time people move with their feet, and the biggest source of moving with your feet is financial concerns and quality of life and the things that everybody mentioned here. And if you move to another place, it is because the quality of life isn't sufficient for you in the place where you came from. It's an opportunity question. And it's challenging, right? Because in other parts of the country, it's hard to do. And Dallas weather and politics, 50 degrees Celsius. Good, Hamad. That's right. For those of us, it's 122 Fahrenheit, but it is. I appreciate it, Hamad. I appreciate your ability to adapt to weather. Weather is a big factor. And so here's the thing. San Francisco's had a history of natural beauty, even in its pre-Silicon Valley days. If we're talking about the nexus of the evolving landscape of San Francisco, gold rush town, whaling a city, port city, important factor in local defense infrastructure in the world wars, post-war recovery, expansion, moving. I mean, it's always been a nexus of political growth and capital. And the hard part is, and this is the challenging part, is I have not yet read a fully convincing argument that argues that it's the end of San Francisco. So it used to be a lot of, yeah, you're right, prune orchards, canning, right? I mean, even, in Monterey used to be a giant fishing area too. And you have all these things that all these industries that existed that people through their resiliency have proven possible. And here's the hard part. Here's the bottom line. Is it more likely that real estate prices will, so if an exodus happens in the manner that people if exodus is severe, that would have an effect on dropping real estate prices, and it would put stress on city services throughout California. Throughout the Bay Area. If we're speaking of the Bay Area, it would reduce the tax benefits, it would reduce other things. But even in cities, again, where we look at the cycles of industry moving out, and even when that's often permanent, right? And you need to look at, say Rust Belt cities that often share much worse weather. Cities like Cleveland with 914,000 people in 1950 dropping to below 400,000 by the 2010 census. Even in these cities, you didn't see per se rapid declines in the real estate prices. What happens was real estate appreciation lagged behind the rest of the country. And eventually in 25 years or 50 years, you or your children, if your incomes are the same, might be able to afford a house, which is terrifying to say. What an obnoxious thing to say. But the problem is what happens is even in cities that struggle, we don't see necessarily rapid individual localized declines in prices. What we see is the prices kind of languish, and then other prices across the country come up. Eventually the area becomes cheaper, and that becomes really tricky. Wow, Byron shared a great story in the chat window too. Sorry to be the same, looking at dumping the 9% California income tax, tough call, but you have family in places. That's huge. That's the issue. Austin, Seattle, as all these cities want California business. Las Vegas wants to have business. Orange, Even OC wants to have it. Stanford wants to move to I think Stanford moves to Utah. But the hard part is, as long as the VCs remain here, as long as the programmers remain here, as long as the innovations happen here, it won't happen anytime soon. And Austin has its own series of advantages and disadvantages. The city is a different city than where it was 25 years ago because of the influx of capital, and people are starting to do the same thing they did in San Francisco and the Bay Area. They're moving out to other places. Have seen the ups and downs of the city. Karen, have seen many types of people, personalities, artists, creatives, movers, and shakers. Is not going anywhere. It's about where we bring it from here. You're absolutely right, Karen. And that's sort of the follow-up here. So tying it back to you, where do you think the Bay Area will go from here? So in the absence of a replacement economy, Stephen, that's a great question. The absence of a replacement economy so that would take not only a massive departure of firms from the Bay Area to other states, it would have to be their workers as well. And that's going to take a long time. But even if that happened, could it happen in the same sense it happened to cities like Baltimore? And could it happen in those senses? That is the $1 million question. It's possible, but we're talking that would be a generational change. That process would take 25, 50, 75 years. It would take a long time. Right. Stephen, no. Brett's much more succinct. That's good. Which company moving to the Bay Area would raise alarm bells for local leaders? Facebook, Cisco, Salesforce, any individual company. So here's the hard part. When you say moving from the Bay Area, are we talking the movement of corporate offices? Corporations exist as pointed out in the comments as disseminated entities, right? Corporations exist in many locations at many times. Dallas-Fort Worth has over 150 publicly traded firms that are located, headquartered in Dallas-Fort Worth itself. And that's a really big deal, and that's substantial. And it's likely that of course corporate offices, CEOs, high-tech executives would move to those places. But the engine of the Silicon Valley economy has always been an incredibly a personnel-driven, highly talented, highly intellectual, highly workforce pool that is highly talented, where you need people like people with advanced programming skills. You need people with advanced economic skills to maintain these jobs in these circumstances. And so to say that if a company itself, if Facebook said they're moving to Texas, I mean, Mark Zuckerberg might move to Texas, but and the executive committee might move to Texas. The question is, their operations centers are disseminated, right? We know that Facebook maintains data centers across a number of states. Where will, and if they argue then at the same time, and this is that self-fulfilling thing, people argue and they say, well, if I can work from home, will I live in another state? And also at the same time, I'm worried about companies leaving. But if companies leave and you work from home and you are sitting in a place where you're comfortable living and you like being close to, the ocean, and you like being close to the cultural attractions of the Bay Area and other things, then you might stay, even if your company is headquartered in Texas. And it's interesting. Income tax, that's a good one. Okay. Oh yes, tax burden is a whole other issue. Chris, I don't diminish taxes at all. But I will say that despite its tax burden, the total tax burden, if you look at the list you sent, especially on Wallet Hub, I like Wallet Hub. This is a fine website you link to here. And maybe I can share the screen here to show you. Let's pick. You can look at all the, let me pick this here. So let's share it. Let's drill down to some tax burden questions here. So tax burden by state, California is there. It's 13th in total, according to this, if you consider property, individual, and sales and excise taxes. It's certainly a high tax state. But a lot of states have varying levels of taxes. A lot of states make up for a lack of income taxes and property taxes and other things. And across the country, there's huge variances. I mean, officially speaking, one of the reasons, and this was featured actually in one of the articles in U-Haul's report about net migration, a lot of people moved to Nashville this year. Tennessee, as it turns out, has one of the most beneficial tax regimes of any place in the country. And this is already linked there. There it is. That's good. Ooh, the life, death and life of great American cities. I'm familiar with this. Good, Karen. This is good. This is good. This is good. Good mixture. We have aspiring professionals. We have lifelong San Francisco residents. San Francisco will persist. It'll go on, just like the multiple versions of the Cliff House that have existed. I got a picture of my great grandfather in an automobile right under the Cliff House that was the one that the second one that existed in 1905. These are good books to read, and they give you perspective on things. But even if you're slightly below peak, you're not anywhere near a death yet, and that's the thing. It's maturing maybe, but you're coming off of another boom period, and I think it's too early to tell. So in all of this data that we found, there is evidence to support. So the facts are more people moved out than moved in at a level that was roughly 25 to 30% higher than last year. Second, real estate prices have remained high across the Bay Area, have declined a little bit among the peninsula. We haven't seen a broad, wide-scale pullback of the workforce yet, given any instance of the economy. And usually what happens where if you are transferred somewhere else, we'll see that in the real estate market. We'll see that in an explosion of listings. We'll see not enough people being able to buy homes and that dropping the price of real estate, or not too many homes in aggregate that exceed supply. And we haven't seen those things yet. And so I'm optimistic that we might see some fluctuations year to year, but it won't be as bad as it could be. But this has been great. Gosh, it's 7:30 already. Albert, what did I miss?
No, I think we had a really fantastic discussion here. And
what a good group this is. You guys are awesome. I'm really impressed. I'm so pleased.
Yeah. So
Karen with some awesome links. I appreciate that.
So thank you all for joining. I think it's great to have this conversation. And so the conclusion I take from this is that in the short run, we're all okay. In the longer run, who knows? But as we always love to say, right? In the long run, we're all dead. Right. So
will your great grandchildren be able to afford a house on the peninsula? This is the question that we'll talk about too. This is great.
The major question.
That's the big question.
And so yeah, it's good to know. I think where things are headed. It's good to inform everyone. So I wanted to thank everyone again for joining us. I'm going to also go ahead and drop the link to some of our upcoming events, and you can join us for those. We have a couple of mock interviews for the next couple of weeks, followed by a couple of webinars, and then Dr. White will have you back here again for the month of April, where we're going to talk about this K-shaped recovery and all of this economic volatility that's currently ongoing. So I look forward to that conversation. With that said, thank you. And Dr. White, did you also want to drop your contact info in case folks wanted to reach you?
Yeah, of course. You can drop in. Thank you all for your great conversations about this. This is good. My name is Riley White. Riley White at unm.edu. Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Hamad. I appreciate that. We can link these things. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. I'm so grateful for your time. And I want everyone to have a fantastic evening and a fantastic weekend. And don't worry, so far, we all like to talk up the disaster, but so far, so good. Keep doing the best work you can. And if you have any questions, come back next week. We'll talk. And I'm looking forward to it. So thank you, Albert, for running a fantastic discussion. And I'm sorry normally we have a back and forth, but
this is great. This is great. I think it was fantastic, and we can do it for another hour and a half next time, and it'll be fun.
This is great. You all brought up some brilliant points. I loved it. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Steve.
Talk to you all soon. Thank you.